reinforcing the theme that all things come around again at some point. And one of the things that you're known for, we haven't had a chance to touch on, is being a monarchist, which means you're an outdated old fuddy-duddy who's hanging on to rituals.
Like voting in the Supreme Court. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong rituals. You're
So I have two questions. One that I'll tie back to our original American history question, and then two, the more practical part of everyday life. One, how would a good Catholic have reacted during the American Revolution? Would he have been loyal to the crown? And what does being a monarchist mean today, anyway, other than picking a side among the Carlists?
Good question. Well, they're both good questions. Okay, well, what would a believing Catholic have done during the Revolution? And the answer is what most of them did do. It would have been a loyalist. But because the leadership, well, let me back up for a second. Firstly, one has to understand what the nature of the American Revolution really was. First and foremost, did you ever read a book called 1984? Well, you may recall that George Orwell, within that book, produces a manual on politics, supposedly by the evil Emmanuel Goldstein. And in that, he explains the nature of revolution, in which the middle tier toss off the top tier with the help of the lower tier, replace the top tier, and then sit pretty until another middle tier comes up. Well, again, like so many things, it's an oversimplification, but it does have a certain amount of truth in it. In the American Revolution, you see a very, very fine example of this. Because who brought you the American Revolution? Was it an uprising of the oppressed proletariat against their evil lords, driving them out, throwing tea in the harbor, and so on and so on and so on? No.
The founders were very wealthy.
Well, who were the four richest men in the colonies? George Washington, John Hancock, Philip Schuyler, and my personal favorite, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the one Catholic among them. And if you look at who the loyalists were in the Revolution, quite apart from office holders who didn't feel they could break their oaths, unlike Washington, Hancock, and so forth, who'd all sworn allegiance to the king, they tend to be members of cultural and religious minorities and people from economically depressed areas. So, for instance, in New England, where the Congregationalists were the established church and Anglicans were a minority, Anglicans tended to be loyalist. Congregationalists tended to be rebel. I say tended because there are exceptions both ways and all around. In the South, where the Anglican Church was established, and the Presbyterians, or the Calvinists like the Congos, were the oppressed minority, there the Presbyterians tended to be loyalist, and the Anglicans tended to be rebel. And you see this because each colony was quite different and had a very different social structure and ethnic structure and so on. You would see this in different ways. In New York State, for instance, my state of birth, the Dutch were at that time still sort of a majority. The more assimilated the Dutch happened to be, the likelier they were to be rebel, the less assimilated, the likelier they were to be loyalists. So similarly, most of the rank and file of the Catholics in Pennsylvania and Maryland tended to be loyalist, but their leadership, like Charles Carroll of Carrollton, tended to be rebel. So, and again, as you see, it's a little more complex than simply, well, a good Catholic should be loyal to the king. It was more complex than that. The fact is that the revolution was brought to you by the people who already dominated the given colony on the colony level, on the colonial level. And for a long time, just as is the case in almost any hierarchical structure, the only chance for relief that the lesser sorts had was an appeal over the heads of their more immediate rulers to the king. So just to give you two examples from Massachusetts alone, there's a town in Massachusetts called, is it Marshfield or Ashfield? Well, I think Marshfield. And there, in about 1770, 1771, the Baptists were extremely upset because they were being compelled by the state church of Massachusetts to pay taxes. The town was all Baptist. It was out in the middle of nowhere, and they had gone out there as refuge because the Baptists were dissenters in the state church of Massachusetts, so they were on the outs. They no longer had quite the same disabilities they had in the early days of the colony, but they weren't in the best of positions either. So you've got this all-Baptist town. The colonial government, meaning specifically the elected part of the colonial government, wanted to impose a congregational minister on them at their expense. They wanted to hire one of their own Baptist ministers because the setup in Massachusetts was that every town had its own minister. Well, they appealed to the king, the evil George III. And George III found in favor of the Baptists. He said, no one should be forced to support a minister not of their own choosing, under the Massachusetts Colonial Charter. Because, you see, that's one of the interesting things. The king administered the law according to each colony. It took an act of parliament to have an overarching law, you see. Anyway, the second example of that sort, believe it or not, Massachusetts has several Indian tribes. And one of these, a branch of the Wampanoags, are called the Mashpees, who live out on Cape Cod in a town called Mashpee. Anyway, the Mashpee Indians were a little bit upset because they were being ruled by a commissioner appointed by the colony. And remember that these colonies were basically autonomous. The royal governor really didn't have a great deal of say-so over the everyday running of the colony. That's important to bear in mind. Well, the Mashpee appealed to the king for their own leadership, and they got it. And then Lexington and Concord, the revolution breaks out. The Mashpee ally with the colony and immediately lose their own government. So, loyalty is its own reward, I guess. Anyway, but I mention all this simply to say that it's a complex thing. Adams claimed, John Adams, who was certainly not what you would call too attached to the king, said that a third of the population were rebel, a third were loyalists, and a third didn't care. He probably was being rather generous toward the rebels, but the fact is that there were an awful lot of loyalists. There were probably more loyalists than there were rebels. But you see, in any revolutionary setup, the vast majority of people aren't interested in the change. At any given moment, the vast majority of people just want to be left alone, firstly. And if they have any interests or loyalties, well, yeah, they're for the existing order. They just want to be left alone for the most part. But revolutions are brought about by determined minorities who know what they want and are ruthless in getting it and will not brook any opposition. And you would be hard put, I think, and this is to include the American Revolution, if you think of the early history, the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion and all that, you'd be hard put to find a revolution that has brought about a better state of affairs than what it replaced. Think about it. Even if the monarchy in question was something that I wouldn't want to live under, like the Manchu Emperor or the Ottoman Sultan, oh, I get it, Mao and Ataturk were better. No. Oddly enough, no. And that's the thing. The American people were never so lightly taxed as they were under the king. And it's funny, but people who could still remember that period, so we're talking about as late as the 1820s and the 30s, they got very nostalgic about it. And once the initial horror of the revolution itself had passed, then the years of the chaos under the Articles of Confederation and the establishment of the new government. Hence, you had folk songs out of the 1820s and 30s, like in the good old colony days when we lived under the king. But, of course, by then it was too late. We were on a different path. We were growing as people. We were accepting ourselves.
I think this goes back to, you were saying that there are no simple answers, but I think this is one of just the questions you can ask an average American. So why did we have the revolution in the first place? He was a tyrant in taxes. And you think about the current American system, the president, at least in his iteration since FDR, even before, in the wild dreams of Theodore Roosevelt, is more powerful than all the monarchs of all the world's history combined.
What
and
people
our tax system.
What people are willing to accept from a government they consider their own because they go through the ritual of voting. We were talking about more rituals earlier? Oh. Anyway, because people go through that little bit of snout counting. And I'm happy to have my snout counted as much as anyone else's. Don't get me wrong. It's great fun. But the fact is that people have the illusion of control. And so they accept treatment that they would never accept from an hereditary monarch. If our Constitution was altered in one respect, if the presidency was made into a hereditary monarchy with precisely the same powers outlined that he has in the Constitution, I guarantee you he wouldn't be allowed to exercise more than what's in the Constitution because people have an immediate suspicion of anything hereditary. But they'll swallow anything elected right in the mouth. It's amazing. Because it goes back to the mythos, the delusion, the idea that just because I can vote, I count for something in the eyes of my masters. Every society has the rulers and the ruled. It's just the way it is. It's the way human societies always organize. You'll have a minority who rule, a majority who are ruled. What makes one society different from another is the nature of those rulers. Myself, I would rather be ruled by people who think they're going to fry in hell forever if they rule me poorly, than by people for whom I'm merely a convenient economic cipher who can be milked like a cow.
Until you're all out.
What's what? Yeah, exactly. And then exactly. And then what's left of me goes off to the glue factory.
To eat chicken McNuggets.
Soylent Green is people. That's coming. Not yet, but soon.
So Charles Coulombe's answer is to have a monarchy and to be a monarchist.
Well, yes, but again, with an immediate caveat, it's not that simple. Because, frankly, you cannot separate, just as you asked me earlier, would the country's problems be solved by having a hereditary monarch? No, not at all. There are many monarchies today, and all of them are, in some ways, as badly off as the republics, for different reasons. Again, people have the odd idea that you make the institutions and everything follows. It's not what happens. Institutions are products of a people and its culture and its religion. Our institutions that we have today fit the American people like a glove. They are what we are. You may say, and I would agree with you, that our masters are disgusting. The things they want are loathsome. But it's what we want. It's what we are. They reflect us. Not through the mythos of voting, but simply because it is what it is. If the average American was not more or less content with what he's got, he'd do something about it. Well, he's not. Everything's fine. It's okay. And why should it be otherwise? The vast majority of Americans get 3 scores a day, or 3 squares, I should say, 3 squares a day. I'm not going to really believe in this recession until I stop seeing all of the anti-obesity ads on television. As long as, what's her name, Jenny Craig is still making a bundle, the recession hasn't really been in enough, It's like the gag, what's the major recruiting motto going to be for the Army in 15 years? Hungry? ? Until we're at that point, we don't really have problems. So the fact of the matter is that the system, as it has evolved in this country, does in fact fit the natural genius, as it were, of the country. It is what we are. You could say, oh, it's terrible that we're dominated by Masonic values. Well, yeah, except that we've internalized them. And that we really like them. Because they make life convenient. Why should we have to evangelize our neighbor when we can simply coexist with him?
Would you have been loyal to the crown? And what does being a monarchist mean today, anyway, other than picking a side among the Carlists?
Good question. Well, they're both good questions. Okay, well, what would a believing Catholic have done during the Revolution? And the answer is what most of them did do. It would have been a loyalist.
You're reinforcing reinforcing the theme that all things come around again at some point. And one of the things that you're known for, we haven't had a chance to touch on, is being a monarchist, which means you're an outdated old fuddy-duddy who's hanging on to rituals.
Like voting and the Supreme Court. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong rituals. You're
So I have two questions. One that I'll tie back to our original American history question, and then two, the more practical part of everyday life. One, how would a good Catholic have reacted during the American Revolution?
supposedly by the evil Emmanuel Goldstein. And in that, he explains the nature of revolution, in which the middle tier toss off the top tier with the help of the lower tier, replace the top tier, and then sit pretty until another middle tier comes up. Well, again, like so many, but because the leadership, well, let me back up for a second. Firstly, one has to understand what the nature of the American Revolution really was. First and foremost, did you ever read a book called 1984? Well, you may recall that George Orwell, within that book, produces a manual on politics